This is CUNY TV, the City University of New York.
Hello, I'm Doug Muzzio. This is City Talk. Albany, no longer the Twilight Zone, Wonderland, where anything and everything can happen. It's no longer the cliche for governmental dysfunction, but instead a model of governing leadership, bipartisanship, civility. A state with a savvy, muscular, and popular governor who, by almost all accounts, has had an extraordinary year. Looking back at Albany in 2011 and looking forward into 2012 are Errol Louis and Greg David, both colleagues of mine at the CUNY Graduate School of Journalism. Errol Louis is the current host of Inside City Hall, airing on New York One, New York's premier political news show. He was a columnist for the New York Daily News, where he served on their editorial board. Greg David writes a blog and weekly column for Crain's New York Business, following 25 years as the publication's editor and editorial director. Greg is director of Business Economics Reporting Program at the School of Journalism. Welcome, Errol. Welcome, Greg.
Thank you, Doug.
Happy New Year.
Thank you. What is the headline and the lead for 2011? What's the headline? What's the lead?
Albany is back. Albany had been a place where there was epic levels of corruption, distrust, dysfunction. Every bad thing you could think of in government seemed to be going on there. And more importantly, the mechanisms to correct them didn't seem to be functioning properly. One thing that did happen in this last year is that a lot of really important legislation that in the past would have almost certainly led to major deadlocks lasting months and causing a lot of misery for the citizens of the state didn't happen. They got through it. They got through really important questions about how to close a $10 billion deficit, how to move something that had been thwarting legislators for years, same-sex marriage. They, at least they got it to a vote. Whether you like the outcome or not, at least they moved the issue. And,
Okay, so things
This
changed.
doesn't usually happen. Things got done.
The triumph of Cuomo. Andrew Cuomo said in his campaign everything that he was going to do. He was going to close a budget deficit without raising taxes. He was going to pass same-sex marriage. He had a whole litany of things he was going to do, and he did virtually every one of them. And unlike so many people who have been governors in the past, he stuck to his commitments. He did not make substantial compromises in 2011, and he carried out his agenda.
What about that tax package?
The most recent one?
The most recent one, that was 2011.
Well, I would say let's put that in 2012.
Oh, okay.
Because that's about the pivot that Cuomo has made in 2012. And frankly, if you want the headline for 2012, my headline for 2012 is the cult of Cuomo.
The cult of Cuomo, interesting. I think it remains to be seen what's going to happen. So I'd put a big question mark for 2012. Cuomo, question mark. Is it going to be another 2011? Well, it really can't be. I mean, it was just extraordinary what happened.
When you get A++, it's tough.
He ran the table. There are people now, in fact, who are going to feel like they are owed something because they bent over backwards to give him what he wanted. And they're not necessarily going to come along quite as easily this time. At least that's what the scuttlebutt is. That's what you kind of hear around the water cooler. You also have some questions that are not going to be quite as easily resolved. I mean, even same-sex marriage, as difficult and emotional as it was for many people in many institutions, it was clear-cut, and it had been sort of thoroughly aired over a number of years. Something like Medicaid reform, which is going to be on the agenda, is going to be a much different, much thornier kind of a question. Something like education. The governor has decided he wants to take on education. It reminded me in some ways of Napoleon kind of waltzing into Russia. Oh, we'll just wrap this up in a few weeks. Well, it's a pretty big question.
A century plus later.
I would dissent on one point. I think Medicaid has actually been solved, in which all the interests that fought previous attempts at Medicaid reform, the hospitals and the healthcare workers union, have actually been co-opted under a system where they've been given control of cutting costs
through these
as long as they cut them. So having overcome this, that's how we're going to reform Medicaid. We're just going to keep doing it. And I don't actually think there will be huge fights over Medicaid. We will continue to change the system. Education, I do agree, is a completely another case.
Okay.
Well, although with Medicaid, I would just point out, I mean, one of the problems, and it's a structural problem, it's not interests sort of dominating or anything like that, but every county's got their own version of what benefits are available. And so now you've got 62 questions on some level about, what do you reform and who wants to reform what? Can you do it without making it one big system where the control is going to come from either an independent panel or from the state? This is unknown. This is unknown territory. And one thing we do know is that the 4% increase that's being talked about for Medicaid benefits is not going to nearly cover the sort of the structural push factors that keep making the cost of healthcare go up.
Okay. But the bottom line is that there are potential pitfalls. This is one of them. What other pitfalls out there? What other major issues are out there that need to be addressed that might present looking at it from a political lens, political problems for the governor?
Well, the first problem, and I actually don't think it's going to be a huge issue, is the budget. And this is where that tax increase, or decrease, as you want to characterize it, comes in.
Saves them a lot of heartache during the budget cycle.
Well, Cuomo decided to deal with the budget in December and get it done.
Yep.
I think that Cuomo's position when he closed this $10 billion budget gap was, I'm going to take all the pain this year, and an improving economy will help me next year. And indeed, remember, Albany went to a, quote, 2-year budget, unquote, that includes this 4% increase in spending on health and education. The governor was determined to keep that promise. And that's why this tax deal is important, because it gave him about $2 billion. Now, he's got to cut the budget by $2 billion. But I think he's already decided how to do that. He's co-opted everybody with the tax increase. It's not like the unions can come back and ask for another tax increase. So basically, he's got to solve the budget, but he's got to cut $2 billion. And he said to himself, I know how to do this. I can do it. That's the first problem, but I don't think it's a huge one.
One of the other problems that's out there is this lingering issue of pensions, public employee pensions.
Absolutely.
And it's not entirely the governor's problem, but it is going to be Albany's responsibility to deal with some serious problems. I mean, I was startled to read that the city of Syracuse paid something like $20 million in pension costs last year. Is going to have to pay $30 million in pension costs this year, a 50% increase. And I don't know what's going on up there, but I'm pretty sure they didn't get 50% more revenue in. So these folks are going to end up knocking at the door in Albany sooner or later.
And there's going to be conflict between the city and the state, which we'll get into later, both institutionally and personally between Bloomberg and Cuomo.
Well, the question is, the city needs pension reform, New York City needs pension reform even more than Syracuse. When Bloomberg took office, annual pension costs were $1 billion. They're $8 billion and rising in the current budget. Now, if you want to know the details, and it's very important, Patterson won a less lucrative pension tier. Remember, this is because we can't change the pensions of any current workers.
Right, by the state constitution.
By doing new workers. But the city didn't even get pension tier 5. Now, Cuomo's proposed tier 6. He says it should apply to the city. He needs to stand and fight. Now, here's where the great conundrum is, because no one I have talked to knows how Cuomo's got the political leverage to get it. Most people I was talking to in November and early December said the political equation was that Cuomo would trade some version of the millionaire's tax for pension reform, but he traded that in the budget tax deal. What is the leverage to get the unions to the table, to force the Assembly Democrats, and let's be frank, Senate Republicans too are in the pay of many public sector worker unions, to go along? And no one I talked to has an answer on that subject. And if the governor has one, he ain't letting on.
Well, he ain't, but that's part of his strategy. He doesn't let on, and we'll talk about the elements of his strategy. What about redistricting? That's another hot one. The governor has said, I'm going to veto any lines that don't come from an independent commission. There ain't no independent commission as of early January. This is a game of chicken. Does he veto?
The governor also said he would never sign an
Right.
increase in taxes for high-income New Yorkers.
Right.
Of course, he says he didn't. He signed a decrease.
Right. The decrease that led to more revenue. So we don't know. I mean, the redistricting, though, is huge. And if anything could be traded for something as big as pension reform, it might be something implied around that. You can't do a straight trade, obviously, because in theory, the governor isn't going to sit there with a map and draw the lines himself. But he does have a lot of leverage. The legislature has gone ahead with the traditional way that they do things. The governor has vowed to veto it. He could, in fact, change his mind about that. Or he could veto it and the very next day implement something that's substantially the same. So they've got this on the table as a possible bargaining element. In fact, we're supposed to see the lines fairly soon.
Right.
So this bargaining is going to start pretty quickly. There's another clock running, of course, which is we've got to have elections this year.
Right.
And you got to know what the districts are.
Right,
So-
and if the primaries move back to August or even move back to June, then you've got a real problem tying together this redistricting and the
It's going to
elections.
happen. It's going to happen very, very quickly. And
Who swerves in this game of chicken?
I don't know who swerved.
it's not the governor.
No, the governor. No, the governor's
This
driving a
district's not gonna
tank.
change.
But the bottom line is, he said, but if I veto it, it's chaos.
This is the issue to watch to determine whether Cuomo continues to stick behind his promises.
This is the linchpin.
In my view, the tax issue is pretty important. He did do something he didn't say, but he came up with this whole cockamamie defense
No, it's
of it.
like, wait a second. I would argue as a policy analyst a little bit that it's not necessarily cockamamie
Okay.
on either principle or practice. So
But
I love to
redistricting,
argue with him. No, I'm sorry.
but redistricting would be a fundamental retreat from a core promise he made
Yep.
in his election
Yeah.
campaign. And it would represent, I think, a significant change in which it would tell us what kind of governor he's going to
Suppose
be.
if he vetoes it and it goes to a special miss, there's no compromise. What does that say about him?
Well, there are a lot of different versions of how you can veto it. I mean,
Go ahead.
You and see, much of this is always sort of talked about. I mean, like the tax deal we discussed, that was a handshake. I mean, they rushed the legislation out after the fact, and some people saw it and some people didn't.
Wait a minute. None of them, sir. Was that, the legislators voted for
Whoever
not?
printed
Wait a
it
second.
saw it.
Talking about, I mean, just as a digression, we talk about sort of dysfunction evaporating in Albany. Come on, the dysfunction was worse. You had one guy making the decisions instead of three.
I mean, the taxi bill, not to throw anything else into the gumbo, but they
Throw it in.
They arrived at a compromise. They had a series of meetings, and then they sort of deferred the actual writing of the legislation. So when it comes to the lines, what is a veto or a threat of a veto or a veto on Monday followed by new legislation that pops up on Tuesday, all of that is possible. So he
but
may
it can't
keep,
be
he may
from
keep his promise.
It can't be from an independent commission by Tuesday, though.
We're past the time. It can't be from an independent. But it can't be from an independent commission. Period, because we've run out of time.
Right.
But let's separate these two issues. First of all, there's the issue of what Andrew Cuomo has given us. He has solved dysfunction in Albany. As someone wrote me in an email, be careful what you wish for. We wished for someone who would do things in Albany. Well, we have someone who will do things in Albany. It just isn't democratic, as in lowercase d. On the redistricting issue, to answer your specific question, he wins if it goes to the courts, because in my view, he fulfills his pledge. The legislature will not gerrymander the state for their own benefit. And as someone who supports that nonpartisan redistricting, I believe a special master is not only a victory, it is certainly a big step in the right direction, because it tells the legislature, you will not, on my watch, draw the lines. So that's a big victory.
But let's entertain a what if. We haven't seen the lines yet, so we can do this. Let's say the lines come out, and they're close to what Common Cause New York and other good government groups had suggested would be a fair
Well, then
way
you've got
to-
the unity maps, et cetera.
Yeah,
But go ahead.
But let's say it's something that makes 80% of anybody who might complain about this happy, including the legislators themselves. How far is he willing to go in principle to say, well, I'm going to veto this because I don't like who put together this all but perfect plan for the state?
Well, I think the principle matters, and we ought to get to the principle, but I think, Errol, dare I call you naive? I mean, come on.
Well, call him naive.
The legislature is not going to produce that kind of map.
Okay. Yeah, you two guys stopped.
Well, that's a flat prediction. I'm not in the prediction.
Oh,
business. I
okay.
leave that to my friend
Then we
the
can move
columnist.
on. I thought there was going to be a follow-up, either physical or otherwise. He's got almost universal praise. I mean, you read the headlines, you read the editorials, etc. Even talking about strange bedfellows. I mean, the business community is running ads praising the government. You know these people. What's wrong with them?
The governor just has them completely cowed. Those ads are the most absurd thing I've ever seen. The second set of ads. The first set of ads.
Wait, define what these are quickly.
Okay. The Committee to Save New York raised $10 million last year to defend the governor's program against what was expected to be an assault from the labor unions and the healthcare
Which never
workers.
materialized.
Never materialized, but the money itself was useful to make sure there was no assault.
Right.
And to get the governor's program through. So far, so good. Then we have this tax deal, which raises $2 billion, raises or lowers taxes, whatever you want.
And they support it
They support it, which was a little bit
glowingly.
of a surprise.
They run
glowingly.
ads after the deal.
And then
was
they
done.
run ads. But look, they're running ads where there's no controversy. I sent an email to someone saying, why don't you hold your money in case there's a fight in the spring? All these ads do, essentially, it's like the super PACs in Iowa. They're being used to bolster Cuomo's poll rating.
Okay, now wait a minute. Why? What is it? I mean,
Because he's so powerful.
Okay, we know he's successful. We know he's powerful. What is it about Andrew Cuomo and how he acts that makes him successful and makes these potential opponents to be allies? What is it?
Well, when it comes to the legislature, it's clear that
And other players.
from his work under his father, from his personal knowledge of many of the legislators, from his knowledge of Albany's ways,
He knows more than any governor, certainly in my lifetime, walking in.
he knows how to talk to them. And he said that up front. He said, look, I know how to talk to these people. And he brings them over to the mansion. I mean, first of all, he lives in the mansion, which Pataki really never did.
Right.
He brings them to the mansion. He wines and dines them. He talks to them. He respects them. He cajoles them. He calls and bullies them at night. He knows exactly how to talk to them. And importantly, he demonstrates to them that he is part of the Albany game, that he respects it, that he doesn't leave the state very often. He very seldom leaves the state.
Just like his father.
He stays and does his work. He refuses to give television interviews to New York One or anybody else.
Well, the reporters, yeah, he's Person of the Year in New York
Well, I
One,
mean, look-
and you have this clock saying he hasn't been on in 1,327 days,
Now,
whatever
the
it is.
effect on Albany legislators and Albany politicians and Albany lobbyists is that he's not out there showboating on Good Morning America. He's not out there, talking up a storm on cable television
none.
news on the national
Very
level.
quiet.
He's not bolstering his national profile at all. The president comes to town, he doesn't even go to the fundraisers sometimes. So that counts for a lot with them, that he's focused and that he wants to make this thing work.
Let's talk about policy.
Go.
Why does the business community support him? Well, he proposed an agenda in the campaign that they could enthusiastically support. He pushed it through. He made a deal on taxes that maybe in their hearts they don't like, but they now want him to move on pension reform, and they want him to continue to put the squeeze on the state budget. Indeed, I thought it was very important that Kathy Wild, who runs the New York City Partnership, when she swallowed hard and supported the tax increase, said, and now we expect the governor to move on to pension reform and to keep spending under control. It's not the tax issue that's so important, it's the growth of state spending. And if he keeps the growth of the state budget to 2%, business will continue to say these are small compromises in the big game.
What about everybody else? What about the other stakeholders? He's got them, either he's so savvy and in his own way Machiavellian in a sense, in a positive sense, that There's something more than that, though. It's more than creating win-wins. It's more than the technique. There's a little bit of Bob Gibson or Roger Clemens about him as well. He's not afraid to throw the high, hard one at you.
But to say,
And then he
to
throws,
say the least.
and then he
But-
throws the curve and the slider and the
Change up,
changeup.
yeah. But let's talk about where the public is, because I think we don't want to leave them out of this equation. The reality is there are civic groups who have complained that the Committee to Save New York has a number of donors who are anonymous. You don't know where all of the money is coming
Right.
from. I've talked to a number of people who have said that they're real estate groups and so forth, that they're contributing to it, but we don't really know. There's not full disclosure there. The governor promised a level of transparency that not all factions would agree has come to pass.
Wait a second. You're being euphemistic here. The budget deal was totally untransparent. It was totally opaque. It was one guy and two underlings in the room. Come on.
And that's not the only bill where that's been true.
No.
I mean, he has.
This is
There's a
classic
bill waiting for
Albany.
his signature that would make documents available before hearings, so that people would know what the hearings are about. It still doesn't have his signature. There's this issue that we glancingly talked about whether or not he'll appear on television and answer questions up front about what he's doing and why. And there are little episodes, during the hurricane, he was said to have put pressure on the
Outgoing
last
MTA, yep.
chairman not to appear in press conferences with the mayor because it would make the mayor look good and he's the governor's guy. And that level of pettiness, which was part of Cuomo's reputation in the past, is not altogether gone. So people have stood their ground and pointed these things out. The public doesn't seem to care. The polls reflect that, and there's some logic.
But he is delivering.
And there's some logic to that, right?
Right.
What people want are whatever they
want
want in
results.
taxes and whatever they want from schools and whatever they want from healthcare. And as long as they're getting that, and it looks like Albany's doing the people's business, not a lot of these questions are being really raised by the public.
Let's move to the interface of the city and the state. The mayor and the governor have huge political egos. They have their own personal and political interest, and they've conflicted. And I think in many cases unwisely on the part of the mayor. What are the potential flashpoints here? What are the conflicts? What are the implications?
Well, let's start with the historical perspective in which mayors and governors rarely get along.
Yep.
Whether it's Rudy Giuliani and George Pataki, remember Rudy endorsed Cuomo in the first race? They're just conflicting pressures and issues on them. The flashpoint, if you ask me, is actually a fundamental one. I hear lots of people in New York City, including the mayor, but I hear academics and others complain, oh, Cuomo's giving the city short shrift. Especially I heard this one scholar of the fiscal crisis say that. Oh, the state has to recognize that the city is its economic engine. Well, in the fiscal crisis, the state bailed out the city because the state economy was good and the city economy was not. Well, guess what? The city economy is good and the rest of the state is not. What do we think we should want Cuomo to do? Take money from the southern tier and send it to New York City? Fundamentals are clear and they will be fighting over them for quite a while. New York City is going to be sending money to the rest of the state.
Which we have forever.
That's sort of controversial, but we certainly do now.
Well, Fernando Wood in 1861 wanted to secede from the Union.
Anyway,
that goes back a
we're going to
while.
have to do that, and that's going to create all kinds of
Right,
conflicts. Now,
right.
the level to which it becomes personal has to do with the taxi cab issue, right? Could you possibly come up with a piece of legislation which makes more public policy sense than to legitimize the livery cabs outside the central business district, improve their status, and make taxi service better? No, you could not, and yet the governor decides to muck it up. And then in the end, and I thought this was the most crucial thing, and then in the end, in his last statement, he says, as a kid from Queens, I know how bad this problem was.
Right.
What?
Right. I mean, look, let me
Go ahead.
humbly suggest that. You said that, yes, there are policy differences and there's also ego involved. Well, ego can, in fact, be the sum and substance of the entire conflict. On the taxi cab bill, I heard from insiders that there were really no policy disputes whatsoever.
Yep.
This was all about ego.
Right,
And
But
then they would sort of yank a policy off the shelf and say, well, here's the reason why I'm
They're constantly sticking it to each other. Last year's budget, constantly sticking it to. And now with the changeover to this Emblem Health, we're in a war between the city and the state. They're going to privatize, and the mayor says, oh, wait a minute, we're going to move our people out.
But this is important. That fight's been going on for 10 years. It predates Bloomberg.
But they're in the ring right now.
But that's the point. These fights are always going on. It went on
So it's
in the last
institutional and rather than personal.
People have been fighting over what to do about the proceeds of that supposed conversion to public status for 10 years. They are institutional.
The fight over the 9/11 memorial has been going on for years.
Forever.
And they're at a
Okay.
crucial point as well.
We're in January. Let's go to June. What's the headline? What's the lead?
Interesting. Assuming that we have districts drawn and an election date selected, that will be the headline, that the upcoming elections are going to happen, and what will the governor do? In particular, will the governor honor a pledge that he's made sort of privately to help the Democrats retake the majority in the Senate? Or will he do what I think almost everybody agrees is in his political best interest, which is somehow prop up a Republican minority and help keep them in the majority?
As a check on...
As a check on the left wing of the Democratic
Party, both at the Senate and the Assembly.
Exactly right.
Headline and lead.
The headline and lead are whether the governor had an ambitious agenda this year and whether it went anywhere.
What was he successful on?
Well, the answer is I think there may be no successes and they'll all be covered up. That the heavy lifting in New York that is doable, in my view, is essentially done.
Okay, the budget.
The budget, the situation about where we are on taxes. Now it's much harder. Is he really going to reform education? His mantra about government consolidation is going nowhere. Is he really going to get pension reform? Or, and this is what interests me, is his vision now going to turn to whether he runs for president in 2016?
Does that change his behavior as governor at all?
Yeah, I think it does, because he doesn't take on really tough issues at this point.
Or does he take them on and succeed, which burnishes his image? I don't know if you've got the psychology right with this guy.
I think fundamental education reform, whoa, that's a really tough issue. If he takes that on, I will raise my hand and salute.
Or he may be looking for threshold levels of success as opposed to
exactly
grand slam home run success.
Right. I mean, and it's a 4-year term, and he runs for re-election in 2014, 2 years before 16.
You know what? I'm not sure people run for president anymore from a sitting position. I'm not sure it's so good. I think if you really want to run for president, a lot of people opt not to run again. Go out on a high note and take it from there.
We'll see. We'll see. My thanks to Errol Louis and Greg David for being on the show. Join us next week when my guests, Lucia Gomez Jimenez, Susan Lerner, and Dick Dady talk about redistricting. Thanks, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, I'm Doug Muzzio. Let us know what you think about this show. You can reach us at CUNY.TV. When you get there, click on the bar that says Contact Us and send your email. Whatever it is. Thanks, no thanks, obnoxious, do it. Send it.